The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse suite at the Grand Ole Opry Hotel in Nashville, each drop echoing like a drumbeat against the glass. Alan Jackson stood motionless, his weathered hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of black coffee, watching the storm rage across Music City. At 55 years old, his face bore the lines of countless late nights on tour buses and early mornings in recording studios. But tonight, those lines seemed deeper, carved by something more than just the passage of time. The suite was everything money could buy: marble floors, Italian leather furniture, a view that stretched across the Cumberland River, yet it felt as empty as a concert hall before the lights came on. Gold records and platinum plaques lined the walls like silent centenars, testament to a career that had spanned 3 decades and sold over 80 million albums worldwide. But tonight they seemed to mock him with their metallic gleam. "Alan, you need to eat something," came a voice from behind him. His manager, Rick Stanton, emerged from the adjoining room, holding a tablet filled with tour schedules and contract negotiations. Rick had been with him for 15 years, watching the highs and lows of a career that had taken them from small-town Georgia to the biggest stages in America. "The car will be here in 20 minutes for the charity gala." Alan didn't turn around. "Tell me something, Rick. When did we stop caring about the music and start caring about the money?" Rick set down the tablet and joined Alan at the window. At 48, Rick was trim and always impeccably dressed, the kind of man who could negotiate $1 million deal before breakfast and still have energy left for an 18-hole golf game. But he'd known Alan long enough to recognize when the weight of fame was pressing down on those broad shoulders. "You still care about the music, Alan. I've seen you in the studio, seen how you light up when you find the right melody or the perfect lyric. That hasn't changed, hasn't it?" Alan's voice was barely above a whisper. "Last week, I caught myself approving a song I didn't even like because the label said it would be a hit. When did I become that guy, Rick? When did I stop being the kid from Newnan who just wanted to tell stories through music?" The storm outside seemed to intensify, as if nature itself was responding to the turmoil in Alan's heart. Lightning illuminated the skyline, casting long shadows across the room. Alan thought about his hometown of Newnan, Georgia, where he'd grown up in a modest house with parents who worked hard for every dollar. His father had been a car dealer, his mother a homemaker who could stretch a grocery budget like it was made of elastic. They'd taught him the value of honest work and treating people right, lessons that seemed harder to remember in the glittering world of country music stardom. "You know what I was thinking about today?" Alan continued, his breath fogging the window. "I was remembering this old diner back home, Mabel's Kitchen. Used to go there with my dad on Saturday mornings. Mabel would always give free coffee refills to the construction workers, never charged extra for an extra biscuit if someone looked hungry. Said it was just good business, but we all knew better. She just had a good heart." Rick nodded, understanding where this was headed. Alan had been talking more and more about the old days lately, about simpler times, when success was measured in full stomachs and honest handshakes rather than chart positions and streaming numbers. "The charity gala tonight," Rick said carefully. "It's for the Children's Hunger Relief Foundation. Maybe that's exactly where you need to be right now." Alan finally turned from the window, his blue eyes reflecting the storm clouds outside. Another photo opportunity? Another chance to write a check and shake hands with donors who've never missed a meal in their lives? Maybe, Rick admitted. Or maybe it's a chance to remember why you got into this business in the first place. You've always said music should touch people's lives, make them feel something. Maybe tonight you'll remember what that feels like. An hour later, Alan found himself in the back of a black Lincoln Navigator, watching Nashville's neon-soaked streets blur past through rain-streaked windows. He'd changed into his best black suit, the one his wife Denise had picked out for him before their divorce 2 years earlier. The separation had been amicable, They'd simply grown apart as his career consumed more and more of his time, but he still missed having someone to come home to, someone who knew him as just Alan, not Alan Jackson, the country music superstar. The driver, a quiet man named Marcus, who'd been driving celebrities around Nashville for 20 years, caught Alan's eye in the rearview mirror. "Rough night for a party, Mr. Jackson." "Seems appropriate somehow," Alan replied, watching a homeless man hurry past a bus stop, trying to stay dry under a thin jacket that looked like it had seen better decades. The Nashville Convention Center was ablaze with lights despite the storm, red carpet runners protected by clear awnings that kept the arriving guests dry. Alan watched through the rain-blurred window as men in $1,000 suits and women in designer gowns hurried from their cars to the entrance, their jewelry catching the camera flashes like stars in the night sky. "Same crowd as always," Rick observed from beside him. "The Johnson family from the oil business, the Hendersons who own half the real estate in Davidson County, Senator Williams and his wife." Alan nodded absently, but his attention was caught by something else. Across the street from the convention center, barely visible through the storm, was a small diner that looked like it had been forgotten by time. The sign read "Mercy's Kitchen" in faded blue letters, and through the rain-streaked windows, he could see perhaps a dozen people inside, their faces illuminated by warm yellow light. "Rick," Alan said suddenly, "change of plans." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'm not going to that gala, at least not right now." Alan was already reaching for the door handle. "Marcus, pull over there across the street." "Alan, you can't just skip this event," Rick protested. "The foundation is expecting you to perform and you've got obligations." "The obligations can wait," Alan said, his voice carrying a firmness that Rick hadn't heard in months. "Sometimes a man needs to remember who he is before he can figure out who he's supposed to be." Marcus pulled the navigator to the curb across from the small diner, and Alan stepped out into the storm. The rain hit him immediately, soaking through his expensive suit jacket, but he didn't care. For the first time in months, he felt alive, felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The diner's door chimed as he pushed it open, and the conversations inside quieted as the patrons recognized him. But Alan barely noticed their stares. His attention was completely focused on a scene unfolding at a corner booth near the back of the restaurant. A young girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, sat alone at the table. She had strawberry blonde hair that looked like it hadn't been properly combed in days, and she was wearing a pink sweater that was too big for her small frame, probably a hand-me-down from an older sibling or a thrift store find. Her jeans were clean but worn, patched at the knees with fabric that didn't quite match. But it wasn't her appearance that stopped Alan in his tracks. It was what she was doing. The girl had her small hands folded in front of her, her head bowed over an empty white ceramic plate. Her lips were moving silently, and Alan realized she was praying. Not over a meal, but over the hope of one. The plate was completely empty, not even a crumb or a smear of sauce to suggest food had ever been there. Alan's throat tightened as he watched her. The other diners seemed oblivious to the quiet drama playing out in the corner booth, lost in their own conversations and meals. But Alan couldn't look away from this small girl, who was thanking God for food she didn't have, holding on to faith in a situation that would have broken many adults. He thought about his own childhood, about the times his family had struggled to make ends meet. His father had sold cars during the week and led the church choir on Sundays. His mother had stretched every dollar until it screamed, but they'd always managed to put food on the table. They'd never been wealthy, but they'd never been hungry either. This little girl was hungry. He could see it in the careful way she held herself, in the reverent attention she paid to that empty plate. She was praying not just out of habit or obligation, but out of genuine gratitude for the possibility that somehow, some way, food might appear. Alan took a step closer, then another, drawn by something he couldn't name. As he approached her table, he noticed more details that painted a picture of quiet desperation. Her shoes were scuffed and worn, held together with what looked like clear tape. Her fingernails were bitten down to the quick, a sign of anxiety that made Alan's heart ache. And when she finally lifted her head from prayer, he saw eyes that held far too much wisdom for someone so young. She noticed him standing there and looked up with startled recognition. You're Alan Jackson," she said, in a voice barely above a whisper. "I am," Alan replied, his voice gentle. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Emma," she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Emma Claire Morrison." Alan slid into the booth across from her, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the worn vinyl seats. "Emma Claire, that's a beautiful name. You mind if I ask what you're doing here all by yourself?" Emma's cheeks flushed pink, and she looked down at her empty plate. I was praying. Mama always taught me to say grace before meals, even when..." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Even when there's no meal yet," Alan finished gently. Emma nodded, tears beginning to gather in her eyes. "Mama's at work. She's got 2 jobs now, and she gave me $3 for dinner. But when I got here and saw the menu..." She gestured helplessly at the laminated menu on the table. "Everything costs more than $3. I thought maybe if I prayed hard enough, God might find a way." Alan felt something shift inside his chest, like a door opening that had been locked for too long. Here was faith in its purest form, untainted by prosperity or comfort. This little girl was demonstrating a trust in divine providence that put his own complicated relationship with success and spirituality to shame. "Where's your mama working tonight?" he asked. "She cleans offices downtown after her day job at the grocery store," Emma explained. "She won't be done till midnight, and I'm supposed to wait at the community center, but it's closed tonight because of the storm. The lady at the front desk said I could wait here as long as I bought something, but..." She held up 3 crumpled dollar bills. "This is all I got." Alan looked at those $3. Money that represented sacrifice and careful budgeting. Money that a working mother had counted out, knowing it wasn't enough, but hoping it would somehow stretch to cover her daughter's dinner. He thought about the gala across the street, where a single bottle of wine cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week. "Emma Claire," Alan said, his voice thick with emotion, "would you mind if I joined you for dinner tonight?" Her eyes widened. "Really? But I can't pay for your meal, Mr. Jackson. I only got $3. "Don't you worry about that," Alan said, flagging down the waitress. "Tonight dinner's on me. And I think we should start with dessert. I hear this place makes a mean apple pie." For the first time since he'd walked into the diner, Emma smiled. A radiant, beautiful smile that transformed her entire face. It was the smile of a child who'd been carrying the weight of the world on her small shoulders and had just been reminded that sometimes miracles do happen. As the waitress approached their table with a curious expression, she'd clearly recognized Alan, but was trying to play it cool. He realized that Rick was probably having a heart attack across the street, wondering where his client had disappeared to. The charity gala was starting, donors were arriving, and Alan Jackson was supposed to be the evening's entertainment. But as he looked at Emma Claire Morrison, at this little girl who'd been praying over an empty plate with more faith than he'd shown in years, Alan knew he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Sometimes the most important charity work happens not on red carpets and stages, but in small diners during thunderstorms, one empty plate and one hungry child at a time. The waitress reached their table, her name tag reading Dolores, and she looked between Alan and Emma with a mixture of recognition and curiosity. "What can I get you folks tonight?" "Well, Dolores," Alan said, his Georgian accent warm and familiar. "My friend Emma Claire and I are celebrating something special tonight. We'd like to start with 2 slices of your finest apple pie, and then we'd like to see your biggest, most filling meals. We're not in any hurry." Emma looked at Alan with wonder, as if she couldn't quite believe this was really happening. "Mr. Jackson, are you sure? I don't want to be a burden." "Sweetheart," Alan said, leaning forward with the gentle smile that had charmed millions of fans over the years, "you could never be a burden. Sometimes God puts people exactly where they need to be, exactly when they need to be there. And I think tonight we both needed to be right here." As Dolores hurried off to get their pie, Alan pulled out his phone and sent a quick text to Rick. "Something important came up. Handle the gala. I'll explain later." Then he turned the phone off completely and slid it into his pocket, giving Emma his complete attention. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the warm diner, something beautiful was beginning. A reminder that sometimes the most profound moments in life come not from stages or spotlights, but from the simple act of sharing a meal with someone who needs to know they're not forgotten. Emma Claire Morrison was about to learn that prayers over empty plates sometimes get answered in the most unexpected ways. And Alan Jackson was about to rediscover what it truly meant to use his success for something that mattered. The apple pie arrived warm, with steam rising from golden flaky crust that had been baked to perfection. Emma stared at her slice as if it were made of gold, her small hands folded in her lap as she took in the sweet aroma of cinnamon and brown sugar. Alan watched her expression with fascination. When was the last time he'd seen someone appreciate something so simple with such pure joy? "Go ahead, sweetheart," Alan encouraged, picking up his own fork. "It's not getting any warmer." Emma took her first bite slowly, deliberately, her eyes closing as she savored the taste. A small sound of contentment escaped her lips, and when she opened her eyes, they were bright with tears of gratitude. "This is the best pie I've ever had," she whispered. Alan took a bite of his own slice and was surprised to find she was right. The pie was exceptional, homemade, with the kind of care and attention that came from someone who took pride in their craft. "You know what, Emma Claire? I think you might be onto something here." Dolores returned to check on them, and Alan could see the curiosity in her eyes. A famous country singer having pie with a young girl in a small Nashville diner wasn't exactly an everyday occurrence. "How's everything tasting?" she asked. "This pie is incredible," Alan said genuinely. "Who's your baker?" "That would be Mercy herself," Dolores said with pride. "Mercy Washington. She owns this place, and she makes every pie from scratch. Been doing it for 37 years, ever since she opened this diner. Her grandmother's recipe." "Is Mercy here tonight?" Alan asked. "I'd love to meet her." "She's in the back kitchen. I'll get her." Dolores disappeared through a set of swinging doors, and Alan could hear muffled conversation from the kitchen area. Emma had been listening to this exchange while carefully eating her pie, making each bite last as long as possible. "Mr. Jackson," she said quietly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart. Anything." "Why are you being so nice to me? I mean, you don't even know me, and you were dressed all fancy when you came in. You probably had somewhere important to be." Alan set down his fork and considered how to answer. How could he explain to a 9-year-old girl that watching her pray over an empty plate had awakened something in him that had been sleeping for too long? How could he tell her that her simple faith had reminded him of why he'd started making music in the first place? "Emma Claire," he said finally, "sometimes we meet people exactly when we need to meet them. I've been having a hard time lately, feeling like I'd lost my way a little bit. And then I walked in here and saw you praying over that empty plate, and it reminded me of something important." "What did it remind you of?" "It reminded me that faith isn't about having everything you need. Faith is about believing you'll get what you need, even when you can't see how it's going to happen. Emma nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to her. Mama says God doesn't always give us what we want, but He always gives us what we need, even when it doesn't feel like it. Before Alan could respond, the kitchen doors swung open, and a woman emerged who commanded immediate attention. Mercy Washington was in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and skin the color of dark honey. She wore a white apron over simple clothes, but she carried herself with a dignity that spoke of someone who had built something meaningful with her own hands. Her eyes were kind but sharp, taking in every detail of the scene at the corner booth. "Well, well," Mercy said, her voice carrying the musical cadence of the Deep South. "Alan Jackson in my little diner. I've been listening to your music for years, young man." Alan stood up respectfully as she approached. "Mrs. Washington, it's an honor. This pie is extraordinary, the best I've had anywhere." "Flatterer," Mercy said with a smile, but Alan could see she was pleased. "Though I suppose you've eaten in some pretty fancy places." "I have," Alan admitted, "but sometimes the best food comes from places where people cook with love instead of just skill." He gestured to Emma. "I was just having dinner with my friend Emma Claire here. She was telling me about your wonderful establishment." Mercy's keen eyes took in Emma's worn clothes and the careful way she was eating her pie, and something shifted in her expression. This was clearly a woman who had seen plenty of hungry children over the years, who understood the signs of real need. "Emma Claire," Mercy said warmly, sliding into the booth next to the girl. "That's a beautiful name. Are you here by yourself tonight, honey?" Emma nodded, suddenly shy. "My mama's working late. Mr. Jackson found me sitting here and offered to buy me dinner." Mercy looked at Alan with new respect. "Is that so?" She turned back to Emma. "And what does your mama do for work?" "She cleans offices at night, and during the day she works at Morrison's Grocery on Jefferson Street. She's been working real hard since—" Emma's voice trailed off, and she looked down at her hands. "Since what, baby?" Mercy's voice was gentle, maternal. "Since Daddy went away," Emma whispered. "He left 6 months ago. Mama says he had some problems he needed to work out, and maybe someday he'll come back, but right now it's just me and her." Alan felt his chest tighten. Here was a little girl carrying burdens that would challenge adults: abandonment, poverty, uncertainty about the future. Yet she'd been sitting in this diner praying with genuine gratitude over an empty plate. The strength of her spirit was humbling. "Morrison's Grocery," Mercy mused. "I know that place. Your mama wouldn't happen to be Linda Morrison, would she?" Emma's eyes lit up. "You know Mama. Honey, your mama has been shopping here for years. She always comes in after her grocery store shift, usually around 5:30, orders coffee and a piece of pie. Always tips well, even though I know money's tight. She's a good woman, your mama." "She is," Emma agreed emphatically. "She works real hard. Sometimes she falls asleep in her work clothes because she's so tired, and she always makes sure I have what I need for school, even if she has to do without." Alan found himself thinking about his own daughter, Mattie, who was now 23 and living in California, pursuing her dreams in the music industry. When Mattie was Emma's age, her biggest worry had been whether her favorite TV show would be on that night, or if they'd have time to stop for ice cream after her piano lessons. The contrast was stark and sobering. "Dolores," Mercy called to the waitress, "bring Emma Claire here the biggest plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes we've got, with extra gravy and some of those green beans I made fresh today, and get her a tall glass of milk to go with it." "Oh no," Emma protested. "I can't afford all that. I only have $3. "Baby," Mercy said with a smile that could have warmed the entire diner, "in my restaurant, no child goes hungry, not ever. That meal is on the house." Emma looked between Mercy and Alan, overwhelmed. "I don't understand. Why is everyone being so nice to me?" Alan and Mercy exchanged a look of understanding. "Sweetheart," Alan said, "there are a lot of good people in this world. Sometimes we just have to find each other." As they waited for Emma's meal to arrive, Alan found himself asking questions he hadn't thought about in years. "Emma Claire, what do you want to be when you grow up?" "I want to be a teacher," Emma said without hesitation. "Like Mrs. Patterson at school. She's real nice, and she makes learning fun. And teachers get to help kids every day, which seems like the most important job in the world." "That sounds like a wonderful goal," Alan said. "Are you good at school?" Emma nodded enthusiastically. "I love to read. Mrs. Patterson says I read at a level way above my grade. And I'm good at math too, except for story problems. Those are tricky." "Reading is important," Mercy chimed in. "I never got much formal education myself, but I've always been a reader. Books can take you places you've never been, teach you things you never knew." "What's your favorite book?" Alan asked Emma. "Charlotte's Web," Emma replied immediately. "I've read it 7 times. I love how Charlotte was such a good friend to Wilbur, how she was willing to help him even when it was hard for her." Alan smiled at the choice. Of course, this compassionate little girl would love a story about friendship and sacrifice. "That's one of the great ones. Have you read any others by E.B. White?" Emma shook her head. "The school library only has that one. But Mrs. Patterson said if I keep my grades up, she might be able to find me some others." Alan made a mental note. This was a conversation he'd be continuing. Emma's meal arrived, and it was indeed generous. A thick slice of homemade meatloaf, a mountain of creamy mashed potatoes with a well of brown gravy, and a serving of green beans that looked like they'd been picked that morning. Emma stared at the plate in wonder. "This is too much," she said. "I'll never be able to eat all of this." "Well then, we'll get you a box to take some home," Mercy said practically. "Your mama's probably going to be hungry when she gets off work tonight." At the mention of her mother, Emma's expression brightened even further. "Oh, she would love this. She never gets to eat anywhere nice. She usually just grabs something from the vending machine at work, or sometimes she doesn't eat at all if money's tight." Alan watched Emma cut a small bite of meatloaf and chew it slowly, her eyes closing again in appreciation. Everything about this little girl spoke of gratitude, not just for this meal, but for every small kindness, every moment of warmth in what had clearly been a challenging few months. "Emma Claire," Alan said. "Tell me about your mama. What's she like?" Emma's face lit up like sunrise. "She's the best mama in the world. She's real pretty. She's got blonde hair like mine, but longer, and these green eyes that sparkle when she laughs. And she's strong too. When the washing machine broke last month, she watched a YouTube video and fixed it herself. She said we couldn't afford to call a repairman, so she'd just have to figure it out." "Sounds like a resourceful woman," Mercy observed. "She is, and she's funny too. Sometimes when she's real tired from working, she'll put on music and dance around the apartment while she's cleaning. She says dancing makes everything better, and she sings sometimes. She's got a real pretty voice." Alan leaned forward, intrigued. "She likes music?" "Oh yes, she loves country music especially. She has this old radio in the kitchen, and she always has it on in the mornings while she's making coffee. She knows all the words to your songs, Mr. Jackson. Sometimes I catch her singing Chattahoochee while she's doing dishes, and she gets this big smile on her face." The image of a hard-working single mother finding joy in his music, singing his songs while doing dishes in a small apartment, touched Alan more deeply than any award or accolade ever had. This was why he'd started making music, to be part of people's lives, to provide the soundtrack for their daily struggles and small victories. "What about you?" he asked Emma. "Do you like music?" "I love it," Emma said between bites. "Mama taught me some songs on this old guitar she has. It belonged to my grandpa, and it's missing 2 strings, but Mama showed me how to play some chords anyway. She said maybe someday we'll have enough money to get it fixed properly. An idea was beginning to form in Alan's mind, but he pushed it aside for now. This evening was about getting to know Emma Claire Morrison, not about making grand gestures. "Play any other instruments?" he asked. "I sing in the church choir," Emma said proudly. "Well, I did until we had to stop going regular because Mama started working on Sundays too. But when we do go, Mrs. Henderson says I have a real nice voice." They continued talking as Emma ate, and Alan found himself more engaged in conversation than he'd been in months. There was something about this little girl's perspective on life that was both wise and innocent, hopeful despite her circumstances. She talked about her dreams with the kind of certainty that only children possessed, and she spoke about her mother with a love and admiration that was beautiful to witness. "Mr. Jackson," Emma said as she was finishing her meal, "can I ask you something personal?" "Sure, sweetheart." "Do you ever get lonely? I mean, being famous must be exciting, but do you ever wish you could just be regular?" The question caught Alan off guard with its perceptiveness. "You know, Emma Claire, that's a really thoughtful question. Sometimes I do get lonely. Fame can be complicated. It's wonderful to have people enjoy your music, but sometimes it's hard to know who likes you for you and who likes you for what you represent." Emma nodded, as if this made perfect sense to her. "Mama says that's why it's important to have people who knew you before you were anybody special. She says those are the people who'll tell you the truth, even when you don't want to hear it." "Your mama sounds like a very wise woman." "She is. She always knows what to say when I'm sad or scared. When Daddy left, I cried for 3 days straight. I thought it was because I did something wrong or because I wasn't good enough. But Mama sat with me and explained that sometimes grown-ups have problems that don't have anything to do with their kids. She said Daddy leaving wasn't about me at all. It was about him not knowing how to be the man he wanted to be." Alan felt a lump forming in his throat. Here was a 9-year-old girl articulating concepts about abandonment and self-worth that many adults never fully grasped, and her mother had somehow found the words to help her understand without becoming bitter or angry. "That must have been really hard," he said gently. "It was. But you know what? Mama and me, we're a good team. We take care of each other, and she says that makes us both stronger." As Emma spoke, Alan found himself thinking about his own relationships, his own family dynamics. His divorce had been civilized but distant, a business arrangement that had dissolved when the numbers no longer added up. There had been no children involved in that calculation, no little girl who needed to understand why Daddy wasn't coming home anymore. "Emma Claire," he said, "you and your mama are lucky to have each other." "I know," she said simply. "Even when things are hard, I know she loves me more than anything in the world, and I love her too." The storm outside seemed to be calming, the thunder growing more distant. Alan glanced at his watch and was surprised to see it was nearly 10 o'clock. The charity gala would be winding down by now, the donors heading home to their comfortable lives, their consciences eased by the checks they'd written. But here, in this small diner, he'd been part of something more meaningful than any fundraising event. He'd shared a meal with a little girl who'd reminded him what genuine gratitude looked like, what real faith meant. Emma Claire Morrison had given him a gift tonight, the gift of perspective. "Mr. Jackson," Emma said, pushing her empty plate away, "I want to thank you for the most wonderful dinner I've ever had. I'll never forget this night, not for my whole life." Alan reached across the table and gently squeezed her small hand. "Emma Claire, the pleasure has been all mine. You've reminded me of some things I'd forgotten, and that's the best gift anyone could give." Mercy returned to their table with a takeout container. "There's enough meatloaf and potatoes in here for your mama's dinner tomorrow," she told Emma. "And I threw in a piece of pie, too." Emma's eyes filled with grateful tears. Thank you, Mrs. Washington, thank you so much. As they prepared to leave, Alan realized this night was far from over. Emma still needed to get home safely, and he wasn't about to let her walk through Nashville streets alone, especially not in this weather. More importantly, he'd been moved by her story in a way that demanded action. Not the kind of grand public gesture that would generate headlines, but something real and lasting. "Emma Claire," he said, "how are you planning to get home tonight?" "The city bus runs until 11, she said. "Mama gave me bus money too." Alan shook his head. "Not tonight, sweetheart. Marcus, that's my driver, is going to take you home safely, and I think your mama and I need to meet." For the first time that evening, Emma looked uncertain. She's not going to be home until after midnight, and she doesn't know about all this. She might think I did something wrong talking to a stranger. "Well then," Alan said with a smile, "I guess we'll just have to wait for her together, if that's okay with you." Emma Claire Morrison looked at this famous country singer who had turned her worst night into her best night, who had seen her praying over an empty plate and had chosen to answer that prayer in the most beautiful way possible. And for the first time in 6 months, since her father had walked out and left her world turned upside down, she felt like maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. "I'd like that," she said softly. "I'd like that very much." Marcus was waiting by the navigator when they emerged from the diner, the storm having subsided to a steady drizzle that painted the Nashville streets in glossy reflections of neon and streetlights. The professional driver took one look at the little girl walking beside his famous client and adjusted his evening without a word of complaint. After 20 years of driving celebrities around Music City, very little surprised him anymore. "Marcus," Alan said, opening the rear door for Emma, "we're going to give Miss Emma Claire a ride home, and then we're going to wait for her mother to get off work. I hope you don't mind a longer evening than planned." "No problem at all, mister." "Jackson," Marcus replied, his voice warm with genuine kindness. "Where are we headed, young lady?" Emma clutched the takeout container from Mercy's kitchen against her chest like it was made of precious metal. "Maple Grove Apartments on Charlotte Avenue. Building C, Apartment 312. Alan had driven past that complex before, a series of 3-story brick buildings that housed working families who were getting by but not getting ahead. It was clean and safe, but basic, the kind of place where people lived while they worked towards something better. As they drove through the quiet Nashville streets, Emma pressed her face to the window, watching the city lights blur past. "I've never been in a car this nice," she admitted. "It's bigger than our whole living room." Alan looked at the Navigator's interior through Emma's eyes, the leather seats, the wood trim, the small television screen mounted in the center console. Things he took for granted suddenly seemed excessive, almost embarrassing when viewed through the lens of genuine need. "Marcus," Alan said, "how did you get started driving for folks in the music business?" Marcus caught Alan's eye in the rearview mirror, understanding that this conversation was as much for Emma's benefit as anyone's. "Well, sir, I started driving cab right after I got out of the army. This was back in '85. One night I picked up a songwriter named Jimmy Webb. You might know his work. He wrote By the Time I Get to Phoenix and MacArthur Park. Anyway, Jimmy was having car trouble, and I ended up driving him around for 3 days while he met with publishers and producers." "Did you know his songs?" Emma asked, intrigued by the story. "I sure did. My mama loved Jimmy Webb's music. So I told him how much his songs meant to our family, how she'd play them on Sunday mornings while she made breakfast. Well, Jimmy was so touched by that, he recommended me to other folks in the business. Said I was the kind of driver who understood that music wasn't just entertainment, it was part of people's lives." Emma nodded solemnly. "That's what Mama says about Mr. Jackson's music. She says his songs tell stories about regular people like us." Alan felt that familiar tightness in his chest again. Your mama's right about that, sweetheart. The best country songs are just stories about real life, the good times and the hard times, the love and the heartbreak, the dreams we chase, and the ones we have to let go. Mama says he stopped loving her today, makes her cry every time, but she still plays it because it's so beautiful. She says sometimes the saddest songs are the most important ones because they help us feel less alone when we're hurting. Marcus turned onto Charlotte Avenue, and Alan could see the Maple Grove Apartments complex ahead, exactly as he'd imagined it. The buildings were well maintained, but clearly built for function rather than form, with small windows and narrow walkways that spoke of efficient use of limited space. Children's bicycles were chained to railings, and a few residents sat on their small balconies despite the damp evening air. "That's our building?" Emma pointed to Building C, a three-story structure identical to the others. "We're on the 3rd floor. Mama says the extra stairs are good exercise, and the view is better up there." They parked in the visitors section, and Alan walked Emma to the entrance while Marcus waited with the car. The lobby was small and functional. Mailboxes on one wall, a bulletin board covered with notices about community meetings and lost pets, and stairs leading to the upper floors. Everything was clean but worn, showing the accumulated use of hundreds of families passing through over the years. "The elevator's been broken for 2 months," Emma explained as they climbed the stairs. "But like Mama says, the exercise is good for us." By the time they reached the 3rd floor, Alan was slightly winded. All those years of tour buses and hotel rooms had left him less physically fit than he'd like to admit. But Emma bounded up the steps with the energy of youth, seemingly unaffected by the climb. "This is us," she said, stopping in front of apartment 312. The door was painted a cheerful yellow, and there was a small welcome mat that read, "Home is where the heart is," in faded letters. Emma pulled a key from her pocket. It was attached to a keychain shaped like a guitar that looked handmade. "Did you make that keychain?" Alan asked. "Mama did. In her craft class at the community center. She takes classes there when she can. Says learning new things keeps your brain young. Last month she learned how to make jewelry, and she made me these earrings." Emma tucked her hair behind her ear to show small silver hoops with tiny musical notes dangling from them. The apartment was exactly what Alan had expected. Small but immaculately clean, every inch of space used efficiently. The living room contained a modest sofa, a coffee table that had been refinished by hand, and a television that was at least 10 years old but well cared for. What struck Alan most, however, was how the space had been made into a home through small touches that spoke of love and creativity. The walls were covered with Emma's artwork, crayon drawings of flowers and rainbows, school certificates for good grades, a handmade banner that read, "Emma and Mama's Castle." Family photos in mismatched frames showed happier times. Emma as a toddler with both parents at various celebrations, beach vacations that must have stretched the budget, Christmas mornings where the presents were few, but the smiles were genuine. "Mama says our apartment might be small, but it's full of love, and that's what makes it beautiful," Emma said, noticing Alan's examination of their home. In the corner of the living room sat an old acoustic guitar on a simple stand, the instrument Emma had mentioned at dinner, with 2 missing strings and years of wear evident in its scratched finish. But it was positioned prominently, like a piece of furniture that mattered, and Alan could see that someone had recently attempted to tune the remaining strings. "That's Grandpa's guitar," Emma said, following his gaze. "He taught Mama how to play when she was little. She's been teaching me, but it's hard with only 4 strings." Alan walked over to examine the instrument more closely. It was an old Yamaha, probably from the 1970s, nothing fancy but solid construction. With new strings and a little adjustment, it would play beautifully. He made another mental note. "Can you show me what you've learned?" he asked. Emma's face lit up. "Really? You want to hear me play? I'd be honored." Emma carefully lifted the guitar from its stand, handling it with the reverence children usually reserved for fragile treasures. She settled onto the couch and positioned the instrument across her small frame, her fingers finding chord positions that had clearly been practiced many times. "This is G chord," she said, pressing her fingers against the fretboard. "Well, it's supposed to be G chord. With the missing strings, it sounds a little funny." She strummed gently, and the partial chord rang out, incomplete but recognizable. "And this is C chord," she continued, moving her fingers to a new position. "Mama says if you know G, C, and D, you can play lots of songs." "Your mama's absolutely right about that," Alan said, settling onto the couch beside her. "Those three chords are the foundation of country music. Can you play D?" Emma nodded and shifted her fingers again, strumming another partial chord. Then, to Alan's amazement, she began to sing in a clear, sweet voice that was remarkably mature for her age. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound, that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." Even with the incomplete chords, even with the missing strings, the song was beautiful. Emma's voice carried the melody with confidence and genuine emotion, and Alan found himself transported back to his own childhood, to Sunday mornings in small-town Georgia, churches where faith was simple and music was worship. "Emma Claire," he said when she finished, "that was absolutely beautiful. You have a real gift." "You think so?" She looked at him with hopeful eyes. "Mama says I do, but I thought maybe she was just being nice because she's my mama." "Mamas don't lie about music," Alan said seriously. "Trust me, I know. Your voice is special, and with some training you could be really something." Emma carefully placed the guitar back on its stand, treating it with the same reverence she'd shown while playing. "Someday, I want to get it fixed for Mama. She used to play it every evening after work, but when the strings broke, we didn't have money to replace them. She said it was okay, that we had more important things to spend money on, but sometimes I see her looking at it with sad eyes." Alan glanced around the small apartment again, taking in all the details that painted a picture of two people making the best of a difficult situation. The kitchen was tiny but organized, with a small table for two and a window that looked out over the apartment complex courtyard. The refrigerator was covered with Emma's school papers, all A's and B's, with encouraging notes from teachers praising her effort and attitude. "Emma," he said, "I want you to know something. What you and your mama have here, this home you've made together, it's really special. I've been in a lot of houses over the years, big fancy places with every luxury you can imagine, but I've rarely seen a place that felt more like a real home than this." "Really?" Emma asked. "But it's so small, and we can't afford nice things like other families have." "Sweetheart," Alan said gently, "the size of your house has nothing to do with the size of your heart. And from what I can see here, you and your mama have hearts bigger than any mansion I've ever visited." They settled in to wait for Linda Morrison to return from work, and Emma showed Alan around their small space with the pride of someone sharing a palace. Her bedroom was barely large enough for a twin bed and small dresser, but it was decorated with the same love and creativity that characterized the rest of the apartment. A bookshelf made from stacked milk crates held her small library, mostly books from the school library and yard sales, but each one carefully cared for. "This is my favorite spot," Emma said, showing Alan a small reading nook she'd created by arranging pillows in the corner near her window. "I can see the courtyard from here, and sometimes I watch the other kids playing while I read." Alan noticed that several of the books were about music, biographies of famous singers written for young readers, picture books about different instruments, a beginner's guide to reading music. "You really love music, don't you?" "It's my favorite thing in the whole world," Emma said. "Well, except for Mama, but music is second favorite. When I listen to songs, I feel like the singer is talking directly to me, telling me stories that help me understand things better. They talked about music, about school, about Emma's dreams for the future, and Alan found himself more relaxed and content than he'd been in months. There was something about this little girl's perspective on life that was both humbling and inspiring. She faced challenges that would overwhelm many adults, yet she maintained an optimism and gratitude that shone through every conversation. "Mr. Jackson," Emma said as they sat together on the small couch, "can I ask you something kind of personal?" "Of course. Do you have kids?" "I do," Alan said, "and 3 daughters, all grown up now, Alexandra, Matty and Danny." "Do you miss them when you're traveling for work?" The question hit Alan harder than he'd expected. "I do, more than I probably realized until recently." "I bet they miss you too," Emma said with the simple wisdom that children sometimes possessed. "Mama says that love doesn't get smaller when people are far apart. It just gets stretched out like a rubber band. And when you see each other again, it snaps back stronger than before." Ellen smiled at the metaphor. "Your mama is full of wisdom, isn't she? She's the smartest person I know, and the strongest too. After Daddy left, I thought everything would fall apart. But Mama just rolled up her sleeves and figured out how to take care of both of us. She said we were going to write our own story, and it was going to be a good one. Sounds like you're well on your way to that good story." Emma curled up against the arm of the couch, the exhaustion of the day finally catching up with her. "Mr. Jackson, tonight feels like a dream. This morning I was worried about how I was going to eat dinner, and now I've had the best meal of my life and made a new friend. Do you think God planned this?" Alan considered the question carefully. "I don't know how God works, Emma Claire. But I do know that sometimes, when we're exactly where we need to be, at exactly the right time, beautiful things can happen. And I think tonight was one of those times." As they waited for Linda Morrison to come home, Alan found himself thinking about the charity gala he'd skipped. By now, the wealthy donors would be heading home to their comfortable lives, their charitable duty done for another year. They'd written checks and felt good about themselves, and tomorrow they'd go back to their regular routines, the problem of child hunger safely compartmentalized as someone else's responsibility. But here, in this small apartment with this remarkable little girl, he'd experienced something more meaningful than any fundraising event could provide. Emma Claire Morrison had shown him what real faith looked like, what genuine gratitude meant, what strength in the face of adversity actually was. She'd reminded him why his music mattered, not because it made him famous or wealthy, but because it connected with people who needed to know they weren't alone in their struggles. The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted his thoughts, followed by the rattle of keys at the door. Emma sat up straighter, her face brightening with anticipation. "That's Mama," she whispered, suddenly looking uncertain about how to explain the presence of a country music superstar in their living room. Alan stood up, smoothing his suit jacket and running a hand through his hair. In a moment he was about to meet the woman who'd raised this extraordinary little girl, the single mother who'd somehow found the strength to build a home filled with love, despite facing challenges that would have broken many people. The key turned in the lock, and the door opened to reveal Linda Morrison, tired from a long day of work, carrying a small purse and wearing the kind of sensible shoes that suggested many hours on her feet. She stepped inside, hung her keys on a small hook by the door, and turned toward the living room with the weary smile of a mother coming home to the person who mattered most in her world. Then she saw Alan Jackson standing in her living room, and her expression shifted through a series of emotions: surprise, confusion, and finally a mother's protective instinct as she looked between this stranger and her daughter. "Emma Claire," Linda said carefully, her voice carrying the kind of controlled concern that suggested she was choosing her words very deliberately. "Honey, what's going on here?" The moment of truth had arrived. Emma Claire Morrison was about to explain to her hard-working mother how a prayer over an empty plate had led to the most extraordinary evening of her young life. And Alan Jackson was about to meet the woman whose strength and love had created the remarkable little girl who'd reminded him what really mattered in life. The conversation that was about to unfold would change everything for all three of them, setting in motion events that none of them could have imagined when the evening began with a little girl praying over an empty plate in a small Nashville diner. Linda Morrison stood frozen in her own doorway, her mind racing to process the surreal scene before her. There, in her modest living room, sat her 9-year-old daughter alongside one of country music's biggest stars, both looking as comfortable as if they'd known each other for years. Emma's face glowed with excitement, while Alan Jackson rose respectfully to his feet, his expensive suit somehow not seeming out of place in their humble apartment. "Mama," Emma said, practically bouncing off the couch, "this is Mr. Alan Jackson, and you're never going to believe what happened tonight." Linda set down her purse with deliberate care, buying herself a moment to think. At 32, she'd learned to trust her instincts when it came to protecting her daughter, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for this particular situation. Alan Jackson looked genuine enough, and Emma clearly wasn't in distress, but the entire scenario felt impossible. "Mr. Jackson," Linda said politely but cautiously, "I have to admit, I'm a little confused about how you ended up in my apartment at 11 o'clock at night." "Mrs. Morrison," Alan said, his voice carrying the same gentle tone he'd used with Emma, "I completely understand your concern. If I walked into my home and found a stranger with my daughter, I'd have the same questions. Would you like to sit down? Emma Claire has quite a story to tell you." Linda's protective instincts warred with her curiosity. Emma was clearly safe and happier than she'd seen her in weeks, but this situation was so far outside the realm of normal that she struggled to process it. She remained standing, her arms crossed, waiting for an explanation. "Mama, sit down, please," Emma pleaded. "I promise everything's okay." More than okay. Tonight was magical. Something in her daughter's voice, a joy that Linda hadn't heard since before her husband left, convinced her to take a seat in the chair across from the couch. "Okay, sweetheart. Tell me what happened." Emma launched into the story with the enthusiasm of a child who'd lived through a fairy tale. She told her mother about going to the diner when the community center closed early, about sitting with her $3 and praying over an empty plate, about the kind country singer who'd seen her there and decided to share dinner with her. "And Mama, you should have seen the apple pie. It was the biggest piece I've ever had, and it was still warm. And Mrs. Washington, she's the owner, she said it was her grandmother's recipe. And then Mr. Jackson ordered me the meatloaf dinner, the big one with extra gravy, and Mrs. Washington said no child goes hungry in her restaurant. Not ever." As Emma spoke, Linda found herself studying Alan Jackson's face, looking for any sign of deception or ulterior motive. But what she saw there was genuine warmth and something else, a kind of peaceful contentment that suggested this encounter had been as meaningful for him as it had been for Emma. "And Mrs. Washington packed up leftovers for you, Mama," Emma continued, jumping up to retrieve the takeout container from the kitchen. "There's meatloaf and potatoes and even a piece of pie. She said you probably get hungry working so late, and she was right, wasn't she?" Linda accepted the container with hands that trembled slightly. The gesture was so thoughtful, so unexpectedly kind, that she felt tears threatening to spill over. "Emma, this is incredible. But I still don't understand why Mr. Jackson would—" "Mrs. Morrison," Alan interrupted gently, "would you mind if I explained my side of the story?" Linda nodded, settling back in her chair with the takeout container in her lap, like a treasure. Alan told her about the charity gala he'd been scheduled to attend, about his recent struggles with feeling disconnected from his purpose as an artist. about looking across the street and seeing the warm lights of Mercy's kitchen. He described walking into the diner and witnessing Emma's quiet prayer over an empty plate, and how that simple act of faith had moved him more than any concert or award ceremony ever had. "Your daughter reminded me of something I'd forgotten," Alan said, his voice thick with emotion. "She reminded me what real gratitude looks like, what genuine faith means. I've been so caught up in the business side of music that I'd lost sight of why I started making music in the first place, to connect with people, to be part of the soundtrack of their lives." Linda looked at her daughter, seeing her through Alan Jackson's eyes, not as a burden or a responsibility, but as a remarkable little girl whose strength and spirit could touch the heart of a stranger and change the course of his evening. "Emma has always been special," she said softly. "Even when she was tiny, she had this ability to find joy in the smallest things, to see the good in any situation." "She gets that from you," Alan said. "Everything I've seen tonight, her faith, her gratitude, her strength, her love of music, that all comes from the home you've built for her. You should be incredibly proud." Linda felt a flush of emotion. It's been hard since her father left. Some days I feel like I'm barely keeping my head above water. I work 2 jobs. I'm exhausted most of the time, and I worry constantly that I'm not giving Emma everything she needs. "Mama," Emma said, returning to her spot on the couch, "you give me everything I need. You give me love. And that's the most important thing." Alan nodded emphatically. "Mrs. Morrison, I've met a lot of children over the years, kids who have every material advantage you can imagine. But I've rarely met a child who's as grounded, as grateful, and as genuinely happy as Emma Clare. That doesn't happen by accident. That's the result of good parenting." Linda wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, overwhelmed by the kindness of this stranger who'd taken the time to see the value in her daughter, who'd treated Emma not as a charity case, but as a person worth knowing. "I can't believe this is real," she said. "This morning I was worried about how I was going to stretch our grocery money, and tonight your daughter taught me something about faith that I'll carry with me for the rest of my life," Alan finished. "Mrs. Morrison, I hope you don't mind me asking, but Emma mentioned you love music. She said you sing my songs while you're doing dishes." Linda blushed deeply. "She told you that? Oh goodness, I'm so embarrassed. I'm sure my singing isn't anything you'd want to hear about." "Actually, it's exactly what I want to hear about. Music is supposed to be part of people's daily lives. It's supposed to make the dishwashing and the commuting and the everyday tasks a little more bearable. Knowing that my songs do that for you means more to me than any award or chart position ever could." Emma bounced excitedly. "Mama, show him Grandpa's guitar. Tell him about how you taught me to play." Linda glanced at the old guitar in the corner, and Alan saw a shadow cross her face. "It's not in very good shape, I'm afraid. We had to choose between guitar strings and Emma's school supplies last month, and school won." "It would win every time," Alan said. "Education is the most important investment you can make in Emma's future. But..." He paused, seeming to make a decision. "Mrs. Morrison, would you mind if I took a look at that guitar?" Linda hesitated, clearly embarrassed by the instrument's condition, but Emma was already jumping up to retrieve it. "Mr. Jackson played it earlier, Mama. Well, I played it and he listened. He said I have a real gift." "She does," Alan confirmed, accepting the guitar from Emma and cradling it in his hands with the reverence of someone who understood the instrument's significance. "This is a good guitar, solid construction, beautiful tone. With new strings and a little adjustment, it would play beautifully." He turned the guitar over, examining the craftsmanship with a professional eye. "This was made in the 70s, probably in Japan. They were making excellent instruments during that period. Your father had good taste in guitars." "He taught me to play when I was Emma's age," Linda said, settling back into her chair. Music was, it was how we connected. He wasn't much for talking about feelings, but when he played guitar, you could understand everything he was thinking. Do you still play? Alan asked, though the answer was obvious from the guitar's condition. I used to play every evening after Emma went to bed. It was my way of winding down, of processing the day. But when the strings broke... She shrugged, leaving the sentence unfinished. Alan stood up, still holding the guitar, and walked to the window that looked out over the apartment complex courtyard. In the distance, he could see the Nashville skyline, the lights of the music industry that had made him wealthy and famous, but had somehow left him feeling empty. Here, in this small apartment with this remarkable family, he'd found something that all his success had failed to provide: a sense of purpose, a connection to what really mattered. Mrs. Morrison, he said, turning back to face her, Emma Claire told me something tonight that I can't stop thinking about. She said you told her that love doesn't get smaller when people are far apart. It just gets stretched out like a rubber band, and when you see each other again, it snaps back stronger than before. Linda smiled at the memory. She was missing her father, worrying that him being gone meant he didn't love her anymore. I was trying to help her understand that love isn't dependent on physical presence. It's a beautiful way to explain it, Alan said. And it made me think about my own family, my own children. I've been so focused on my career that I've let those rubber bands stretch pretty thin. He walked back to the couch, still holding the guitar, and sat down beside Emma. But tonight, spending time with you and Emma Claire, I remembered something important. Success isn't just about what you accomplish. It's about who you touch along the way, whose lives you make a little better. Linda studied his face, seeing something there that hadn't been present when he'd first arrived. He looked more peaceful somehow, as if a weight he'd been carrying had been lifted from his shoulders. Mr. Jackson, she said carefully, I want to thank you for what you did for Emma tonight. Not just the dinner, though that was incredibly generous, but for seeing her, for taking the time to talk with her, for making her feel special. She's been through so much these past few months, and tonight she looks happier than I've seen her since her father left. Alan finished gently. Linda nodded, not trusting her voice. Mrs. Morrison, can I ask you something? And please feel free to tell me it's none of my business, but do you think he'll come back? Linda was quiet for a long moment, and Alan could see her choosing her words carefully. I don't know, she said finally. David has some problems he needs to work through. Problems with alcohol, with responsibility, with being the man he wants to be versus the man he actually is. When he left, he said he needed time to figure things out. But you're not waiting for him, Alan observed. No, Linda said firmly. I can't put my life or Emma's life on hold, waiting for someone else to decide who they want to be. We're building our own future, making our own way. If David gets his life together and wants to be part of that future, we'll deal with that when it happens. But in the meantime, Emma and I are just fine on our own. Alan heard the strength in her voice, the quiet determination of a woman who'd been forced to rely on herself and had discovered she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. You're a remarkable woman, Linda Morrison. Emma is lucky to have you as her mother. I'm lucky to have her as my daughter, Linda replied. She's taught me more about courage and faith than I ever thought possible. Emma, who'd been listening to this conversation with the wisdom of a child who'd been forced to grow up faster than she should have, looked between her mother and Alan with bright eyes. Mr. Jackson, can I ask you something? Of course, sweetheart. When you were little, did you know you wanted to be a famous singer? Alan smiled at the question. You know what, Emma Claire? When I was your age, I just knew I loved music. I loved listening to it. I loved singing along with the radio, and I loved the way it made me feel. I didn't think about being famous. I just thought about making music that would touch people's hearts the way other people's music touched mine. Like tonight? Emma asked, with that uncanny perceptiveness that had characterized all their conversations. Exactly like tonight, Alan confirmed. Tonight reminded me that the best part of making music isn't the fame or the money. It's moments like this, when you connect with people and maybe make their lives a little better. Linda looked at the clock on the wall. It was nearly midnight, and she knew she should probably encourage this magical evening to come to an end. Emma had school in the morning, and she herself had to be at the grocery store by 8. But she was reluctant to break the spell that seemed to have settled over their small apartment. "Mrs. Morrison," Alan said, seeming to read her thoughts, "I know it's late and you both need your rest, but before I go, there's something I'd like to discuss with you." Linda felt a flutter of nervousness. The evening had been so perfect, so unexpectedly wonderful, that she was afraid of what might come next. "What Emma has shown me tonight," Alan continued, "her faith, her strength, her incredible spirit, it's inspired me in a way I haven't felt in years, and I'd like to find a way to be part of your lives if you'd let me. Not as a celebrity doing charity work, but as someone who's genuinely come to care about you both." Linda's heart began to race. "What do you mean?" Alan stood up, still holding the guitar, and walked to the window again. "I mean, I'd like to help, in whatever way would be most meaningful. Emma told me she wants to be a teacher someday. Maybe there's a way I can help with her education. You mentioned you've been stretching your grocery budget. Maybe there's something I can do about that. And this guitar," he held up the instrument, "this guitar deserves to make music again." "Mr. Jackson," Linda said carefully, "that's incredibly generous, but I can't accept charity. Emma and I, we take care of ourselves." "It wouldn't be charity," Alan said, turning back to face her. It would be paying forward a gift that Emma gave me tonight. She reminded me why I became a musician in the first place. That's worth more than any amount of money I could ever spend." Emma looked between her mother and Alan, with hope shining in her eyes. "Mama, could we maybe be friends with Mr. Jackson? Like real friends, not just for one night?" Linda felt tears threatening again. The offer was tempting, more than tempting. It was everything they needed. Financial help, support for Emma's education, a chance for her daughter to maintain this connection with someone who clearly saw her value. But accepting help had always been difficult for Linda. She'd been raised to be self-sufficient, to work for what she needed. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "This has all been so unexpected, so overwhelming. I need some time to process everything that's happened tonight." Alan nodded understandingly. "Of course, take all the time you need. But Linda, may I call you Linda? I want you to know that tonight has changed something in me. Emma Claire has given me a gift I'll treasure for the rest of my life, and I'd like the chance to give something back." He walked over to where Emma sat on the couch and gently placed the guitar in her lap. "In the meantime, sweetheart, I want you to have this." Emma's eyes went wide. "But Mr. Jackson, this isn't yours to give. It's Mama's guitar." "Actually," Alan said with a smile, "I think it's becoming your guitar. Your mama taught you to play it, and now it's time for you to make it your own. But first, we're going to get it properly restrung and tuned so it can make the beautiful music it was designed for." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, writing something on the back before handing it to Linda. "That's my personal number," he said. "Not my manager's number, not my publicist's number. Mine. I'd like to stay in touch if that's okay with you. Maybe we could have dinner again sometime, somewhere with better pie than even Mercy's kitchen." Linda looked at the card in her hand, at this tangible proof that the evening had really happened. "I'd like that," she said softly. "I'd like that very much." Alan gathered his jacket and prepared to leave, but Emma jumped up from the couch, still clutching the guitar. "Mr. Jackson, before you go, could I sing something for you? Something to say thank you for the most wonderful night of my life." "I'd be honored," Alan said, settling back onto the couch. Emma positioned the guitar carefully, her small fingers finding the familiar chord positions despite the missing strings. And then, in that same clear, sweet voice that had moved Alan earlier, she began to sing, "Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your blessings, see what God hath done. Count your blessings, name them one by one, and it will surprise you what the Lord hath done." As Emma sang, Alan felt tears streaming down his face. Here was a little girl who had every reason to be angry at the world, to feel sorry for herself, to question why life had dealt her such a difficult hand. Instead, she was singing about counting blessings, about recognizing the good things in life, even when they seemed small or rare. When she finished, the apartment was filled with a profound silence. Linda was crying too, overwhelmed by her daughter's strength and the generosity of the stranger who'd chosen to see that strength and celebrate it. "Emma Claire," Alan said, his voice thick with emotion. "That was the most beautiful performance I've ever heard. Not because it was technically perfect, though your voice is truly special, but because it came from your heart. You sing like someone who understands what the words mean." "I do understand," Emma said simply. "Even when things are hard, there's always something to be thankful for. Tonight, I'm thankful for apple pie and meatloaf and new friends and the best mama in the world." Alan stood up, knowing that if he stayed much longer, he'd never want to leave. "Ladies, this has been the most meaningful evening I've had in years. Thank you for welcoming me into your home, for sharing your stories with me, for reminding me what really matters in life." He hugged Emma goodbye, and she whispered in his ear, "Thank you for answering my prayer, Mr. Jackson. Thank you for teaching me how to pray again," he whispered back. As Linda walked him to the door, Alan turned for one last look at the small apartment that had given him such a profound gift. Emma was sitting on the couch with the guitar across her lap, her face glowing with happiness, and he knew that no matter what happened next, this night would stay with him forever. "Linda," he said at the door, "I meant what I said about staying in touch. Emma Claire is a special little girl, and you're raising her to be an extraordinary woman. I'd consider it an honor to be part of that journey, in whatever way feels right to you." "I'll call you," Linda promised. "Once I've had some time to think, to figure out how to process all of this, I'll call." Alan nodded and headed for the stairs, where Marcus was waiting to drive him back to his penthouse suite at the Grand Ole Opry Hotel. But as he walked down the hallway, he could hear Emma's voice through the apartment door, singing softly to herself as she experimented with the guitar's remaining strings. For the first time in months, Alan Jackson felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. Emma Claire Morrison had prayed over an empty plate and had somehow filled an emptiness in his soul that he hadn't even realized was there. The most beautiful chapter of this story was just beginning. 3 months later, Alan Jackson stood backstage at the Ryman Auditorium, looking out at an audience that included some of the biggest names in country music. Tonight was the annual Songs from the Heart benefit concert, an event he'd helped organize to support music education programs in Nashville's public schools. But for the first time in his career, he was nervous, not about his own performance, but about the young girl who would be joining him on stage tonight. Emma Claire Morrison sat in a chair nearby, her strawberry blonde hair neatly braided with small white ribbons, wearing a beautiful blue dress that brought out her eyes. In her hands, she held a guitar, not her grandfather's old Yamaha, though that had been lovingly restored and held a place of honor in their apartment, but a brand new acoustic guitar sized perfectly for her small frame. Her fingers moved nervously over the strings, practicing chord changes that had become second nature over the past several months. "You nervous, sweetheart?" Alan asked, crouching down beside her chair. Emma looked up at him with a smile that had grown more confident over the weeks they'd known each other. A little bit. But Mama says being nervous just means something is important to you. And this is really important to me. Where is your mama? Alan asked, glancing around the backstage area. She's out front with Mrs. Patterson, that's my teacher, and some of the other parents from school. She wanted to watch from the audience so she could see my face when I sing. Emma's expression grew thoughtful. Mr. Jackson, do you think Daddy might be watching tonight? Mama said the concert is on TV. Alan's chest tightened slightly at the question. David Morrison had indeed reached out after seeing a local news story about his daughter's upcoming performance with Alan Jackson. The conversation between Linda and her estranged husband had been brief and complicated, filled with his promises to get clean and her cautious hope that he might finally be ready to be the father Emma deserved. But tonight wasn't about David Morrison. It was about celebrating how far Emma and Linda had come. I don't know, Emma Claire, Alan said honestly. But I know this, whether he's watching or not, your mama is out there bursting with pride, and you're about to show everyone what real talent looks like. The past 3 months had transformed all their lives in ways none of them could have imagined that rainy night at Mercy's kitchen. True to his word, Alan had stayed in touch with the Morrison family, but not in the way Linda had initially feared. Instead of swooping in with grand gestures and overwhelming generosity, he'd become something neither she nor Emma had expected, a friend. It had started with small things. New strings for the grandfather's guitar, delivered with a note that said, "Every instrument deserves to make music." A box of books for Emma's growing library, including several advanced readers that challenged her accelerating skills. Gift certificates to the local grocery store that appeared in their mailbox without fanfare or expectation of gratitude. But more importantly, Alan had given them his time and attention. He'd started stopping by the apartment once a week, sometimes bringing his own guitar for impromptu music lessons, other times just sitting at their small kitchen table sharing coffee with Linda while Emma did her homework. He'd attended Emma's school performances, cheered from the audience at her talent show, and gradually become woven into the fabric of their daily lives. Linda had been skeptical at first, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the famous country star to grow bored with their ordinary lives and move on to more exciting pursuits. But Alan had proven remarkably consistent, showing up when he said he would, remembering details about Emma's schoolwork and Linda's job struggles, becoming someone they could count on. 5 minutes to showtime, came a voice from the stage manager, and Alan felt Emma's hand slip into his. Will you stay with me until it's time? She asked. Wild horses couldn't drag me away, Alan assured her, and he meant it. Over the past months, this little girl had become like family to him. Her progress as a musician had been remarkable. She was a natural, with an ear for harmony that couldn't be taught, and a voice that grew stronger and more confident with each lesson. But more than that, her presence in his life had continued to provide the sense of purpose he'd been missing for so long. The concert had been Alan's idea, born from conversations with Linda about the lack of music programs in Emma's school. He discovered that budget cuts had eliminated music classes from most of the district's elementary schools, leaving children like Emma with no opportunity to explore their musical gifts unless their families could afford private lessons, which most could not. You know what the real tragedy is? Linda had said one evening as they sat in her living room watching Emma practice her guitar. There are probably dozens of kids in Emma's school alone who have musical talent, but they'll never discover it because they don't have access to instruments or instruction. That conversation had sparked an idea that grew into tonight's benefit concert. Alan had reached out to his contacts in the music industry, and the response had been overwhelming. Keith Urban had volunteered to perform, followed by Carrie Underwood, Blake Shelton, and a dozen other major stars. Corporate sponsors had stepped forward and ticket sales had exceeded all expectations. But the evening's most anticipated moment was Emma Claire Morrison's performance with Alan Jackson, the little girl whose prayer over an empty plate had inspired this entire event. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the announcer's voice from the main stage, "please welcome Alan Jackson." Alan gave Emma's hand a squeeze. "This is it, sweetheart. Remember, just sing from your heart, the way you did that first night at the diner." He walked out onto the historic Ryman stage to thunderous applause, the same stage where legends like Hank Williams and Patsy Cline had performed, where the Grand Ole Opry had made its home for decades. The audience was filled with music industry executives, fellow performers, and hundreds of parents and children from Nashville's public schools, people who understood that tonight was about more than entertainment. "Good evening, Nashville," Alan said into the microphone, his voice carrying easily through the packed auditorium. "Thank you all for being here tonight for such an important cause. Music education isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. It teaches children discipline, creativity, and self-expression. It builds confidence and provides an outlet for emotions that might otherwise have nowhere to go." The audience applauded, but Alan held up a hand to continue. 3 months ago, I met a little girl who reminded me why I became a musician in the first place. She showed me what real faith looks like, what genuine gratitude means, and what it's like to find joy in the simplest things. Tonight, I'd like you to meet her too." Alan began to play the opening chords of Amazing Grace on his guitar, the same song Emma had sung for him that first night in her apartment. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Miss Emma Claire Morrison." Emma walked onto the stage with the poise of someone far older than her 9 years, her new guitar slung across her shoulder, her face glowing under the stage lights. The audience fell silent as she took her place beside Alan at the microphone. "Hi everyone," she said, her voice clear and confident. 3 months ago, I was sitting in a diner praying over an empty plate because I was hungry and scared and didn't know where my next meal was coming from. Mr. Jackson saw me there and decided to share his dinner with me, but more than that, he shared his friendship. Linda Morrison sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face as she watched her daughter address an audience of 2,000 people with the same grace and honesty she showed in their small apartment. "That night taught me something important," Emma continued. "Sometimes when we pray, God doesn't just give us what we ask for, He gives us what we need, even when we didn't know we needed it. I prayed for dinner, but God gave me a friend who's helped my mama and me in ways I never could have imagined." Emma positioned her guitar and found her chord placement, her small fingers confident on the fretboard. "This song is about recognizing the good things in our lives, even when times are hard. It's about having faith that everything happens for a reason, and that sometimes the most beautiful things come from the most difficult moments." She began to sing, her voice pure and strong. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." Alan joined in on the harmony, his deeper voice blending perfectly with Emma's clear soprano. But he wasn't really performing. He was witnessing something extraordinary. This little girl, who just months ago had been praying over an empty plate, was now commanding the attention of one of country music's most prestigious venues, sharing her story with courage and grace that left the audience spellbound. As they moved into the second verse, Alan could see faces in the audience openly weeping. These weren't tears of pity, but tears of recognition of the power of resilience, the beauty of faith, the importance of community coming together to support its most vulnerable members. "'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed." When the song ended, the Ryman Auditorium erupted in applause that seemed to last forever. Emma looked out at the sea of standing audience members, her eyes finding her mother in the front row, and her smile could have powered the entire building. But Alan wasn't finished. He'd planned something special for this moment, something he'd been working on with Emma for weeks. "Emma Claire," he said into the microphone, "would you like to tell everyone about the song we wrote together?" Emma's eyes lit up with excitement. Over the past month, she and Alan had been collaborating on an original song, her first attempt at songwriting, guided by his experience but driven by her own unique perspective on life, faith, and the power of community. "We wrote a song about that night at the diner," Emma explained to the audience, "about how sometimes the most important moments in our lives come when we least expect them. It's called Empty Plate, Full Heart." Alan began to play a melody he'd crafted around Emma's simple but profound lyrics, and Emma began to sing words that had come straight from her 9-year-old heart. "Sitting in that diner chair, with nothing on my plate, talking to the Lord above about my hungry fate, mama working double shifts, trying to make ends meet, praying that somehow we'd find enough for me to eat. But sometimes, when you're asking for the things you think you need, the Lord has bigger plans in store than what you first believed, 'cause I prayed for just a meal that night, but got so much more a friend who saw me sitting there and walked right through that door, empty plate. But my heart's so full, empty plate, but my heart's so full. Sometimes the blessings that we need aren't the ones we're looking for. Empty plate, but my heart's so full." The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word of this simple but powerful song. Here was a child's perspective on hardship and hope, delivered with the authenticity that only comes from lived experience. Now, when I see other kids who don't have much to eat, I remember that cold, rainy night and how a stranger's deed reminded me that kindness lives in people everywhere, and when we help each other out, it shows how much we care. My mama always told me that love's like a rubber band. It stretches when we're far apart, but doesn't break or bend, and when we come together again, it's stronger than before. That's what I learned about friendship on that cold November floor. Empty plate, but my heart's so full, empty plate, but my heart's so full. Sometimes the blessings that we need aren't the ones we're looking for. Empty plate, but my heart's so full. As Emma sang the final chorus, Alan noticed something happening in the audience. People were reaching for each other, parents hugging their children, strangers wiping tears from neighbors' faces, an entire community connected by the simple power of one little girl's story. When the song ended, the applause was different than before, deeper, more meaningful, the kind of response that comes not from being entertained, but from being moved to the core. Emma looked out at the audience with wonder. "Thank you for listening to my story," she said simply. "And thank you for caring about kids like me who need music in their lives. Music doesn't just teach us how to play instruments or sing songs. It teaches us how to hope." Alan put his arm around Emma's shoulders as they took their bow together. Ladies and gentlemen, Emma Claire Morrison, living proof that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places. As they walked off stage together, Alan felt the same sense of completion he'd experienced that night at Mercy's Kitchen. The benefit concert would go on to raise over $500,000 for music education programs in Nashville schools. Emma's performance would be shared millions of times on social media, inspiring other communities to support arts education for underprivileged children. But for Alan, the numbers and accolades would never be as meaningful as the simple fact that a little girl's prayer over an empty plate had led to this moment. A moment where music, community, and compassion had come together to create something beautiful. "How do you feel?" he asked Emma as they reached the backstage area. "Full," she said with a grin. "Not hungry full, but heartful, just like in our song." Linda appeared backstage, her face glowing with pride and joy. She swept Emma into her arms, spinning her around in celebration. "Baby girl, you are absolutely incredible. I am so proud of you I could burst." "Did you see all those people, Mama? They were really listening, and some of them were crying. Good crying, not sad crying. They were crying because you touched their hearts," Linda said, setting Emma down and smoothing her hair, "just like you touched Mr. Jackson's heart that first night." Alan watched this reunion between mother and daughter, this celebration of how far they'd all come in just a few months. Linda Morrison was no longer the exhausted, overwhelmed single mother he'd met that night. She still worked hard. She'd been promoted to assistant manager at the grocery store and had been able to quit her night cleaning job. But there was a lightness about her now, a confidence that came from knowing she wasn't facing life's challenges alone. "Mrs. Morrison," came a voice from behind them. They turned to see a man in an expensive suit approaching. Someone Alan recognized as a talent scout from one of Nashville's biggest music labels. "My name is Robert Chen from Bluebird Records," the man continued. "I wanted to talk to you about Emma's future in music. That performance tonight was extraordinary. She has a rare gift that could take her very far in this industry." Linda's protective instincts immediately kicked in. "Mr. Chen, Emma is 9 years old. She's not looking for a recording contract. She's looking to be a kid." Alan stepped forward, understanding Linda's concern. "Mr. Chen, I appreciate your interest in Emma's talent, but her family isn't interested in the business side of music right now. Emma's gift is too precious to rush into commercial exploitation." Robert Chen looked disappointed, but handed Linda his business card anyway. "I understand completely, but please keep this for the future. When Emma is older, if she decides she wants to pursue music professionally, we'd love to work with her." After Chen walked away, Linda looked at the business card with a mixture of pride and apprehension. "It's all happening so fast," she said to Alan. 6 months ago, we were struggling to put food on the table, and now record labels are interested in Emma. I'm afraid I'm in over my head." "Linda," Alan said gently, "you've been handling everything beautifully. Emma's talent is remarkable, but you're raising her to be a remarkable person first. That's far more important than any recording contract could ever be." Emma, who had been quietly listening to this conversation, looked up at her mother with those wise eyes that never failed to amaze Alan. "Mama, I don't want to be famous right now. I just want to keep learning and growing and helping other kids find music like I did. Is that okay?" Linda hugged her daughter tightly. "Baby girl, that's more than okay. That's perfect." As the evening wound down and other performers took the stage, Alan found himself reflecting on how profoundly his life had changed since that rainy night 3 months ago. He'd rediscovered his passion for music, found a new sense of purpose in supporting music education, and gained a family he'd never expected in Linda and Emma Morrison. His relationship with his own daughters had improved dramatically as well. Inspired by his connection with Emma, he'd reached out to Alexandra, Matty, and Danny, making time for regular phone calls and visits that weren't rushed or squeezed between tour dates. He'd learned to be present in their lives the way he was learning to be present in Emma's. "Mr. Jackson," Emma said as they prepared to leave the Ryman, "can I ask you something?" "Always, sweetheart." "Do you think that night at the diner happened because it was supposed to happen? Like, do you think God planned for us to meet?" Alan considered the question seriously. "You know, Emma Claire, I've learned that some questions don't have simple answers. But I do know this. Meeting you and your mama has been one of the best things that ever happened to me. Whether that was God's plan or just the most beautiful coincidence in the world, I'm grateful for it every single day." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "Mama says that sometimes the most important things in life look like accidents, but they're really blessings in disguise. Your mama is a very wise woman." As they walked out of the Ryman Auditorium together, Alan Jackson, the country music superstar, Linda Morrison, the hard-working single mother, and Emma Claire Morrison, the little girl with the enormous heart and the voice of an angel. They looked like what they had become, a family bonded not by blood, but by the kind of love that grows when people choose to care for each other. The benefit concert had been a tremendous success, raising money that would provide music education for thousands of children in Nashville's schools. But the real success story was walking out into the Nashville night together. Three people whose lives had been transformed by the simple act of kindness that began when a famous singer saw a little girl praying over an empty plate and decided to do something beautiful. 6 months later, Emma Claire Morrison would start taking violin lessons at her school, part of the new music program funded by that night's concert. Linda Morrison would begin taking evening business classes, working toward her dream of someday opening her own small restaurant, inspired, she said, by the kindness she'd witnessed at Mercy's Kitchen. And Alan Jackson would continue to find his purpose not just in making music, but in using that music to build bridges between people, to support causes that mattered, and to remember that the most important audience for any performer is the one that needs the music most. David Morrison did eventually return to Nashville, clean and sober and ready to try being the father Emma deserved. But that's another story, one of redemption and second chances, of a family learning to heal and grow stronger in the broken places. Tonight, as they walked out under the Nashville stars, their hearts were full in all the ways that mattered most. Emma Claire Morrison had prayed over an empty plate and had received more than she'd ever dreamed of asking for. Alan Jackson had looked across a storm-soaked street and had found his way back to everything he'd forgotten about why music mattered. And somewhere in the distance, the lights of Mercy's Kitchen still glowed warm and welcoming, ready to provide comfort and nourishment to anyone who walked through its doors. A reminder that sometimes the most beautiful miracles begin with the simple act of seeing someone who needs help and choosing to care. The empty plate had become a full heart, and the full heart had become a song that would echo through the lives of everyone it touched, creating ripples of kindness that would spread far beyond anything any of them could have imagined on that rainy November night when a prayer was answered in the most unexpected and beautiful way possible.